So in this video, I'm going to talk about the concept of thinking and whether or not there's any reason to actually think about things. And it's kind of coming from the context of meditation and the idea that this isn't necessarily the way that it really is, but it's the way that it's presented a lot of times is that thinking gets in the way of concentration and mindfulness. And the way to get better at meditation is to find ways to get yourself to think less. And I think presented that way is pretty obviously a simplification of the reality, but I'll just discuss my thoughts about thinking a little bit and I guess hopefully present a more nuanced idea, a more nuanced view of the way that thinking interacts with um, the practice of meditation, you know? Mm. Because I guess the first thing to make clear is that we don't really decide to think. Like there are times when we sit down and we say, I'm gonna think about this thing and make a decision or something like that. But for the most part, our thoughts just kind of happen on their own. And we essentially choose. Yeah, it's hard to explain it super clearly, but it's like we can decide whether or not to identify ourselves with the thinking process or the process that decides to think. But it's kind of the common view that we make the decisions to think. Like we are the one that initiates thoughts and the one that um, essentially generates the content of thoughts. And until you work your way out of that view, it's it's hard to see the thoughts that you're having in your head as separate from yourself. I think from that viewpoint of seeing that your thoughts are you, or it's more like people think that they like their thoughts are theirs, like they own the thoughts and they are responsible for them. And I think from that viewpoint, it almost feels like a personal offense to say that you should think less or that the thoughts you have aren't useful or necessary. And obviously, if there's an idea like a recommendation for a practice that at its core feels like an offense, you're not gonna be too likely to follow it. Or if you do follow it, you won't do it very happily, you know. And that's really a very important thing in meditation from my perspective is to like enjoy the practice you're doing and not to try to impose the practice on yourself and think that it's something that you need to do rather than like something that you need to do but don't want to do because yeah, you're just not gonna put your heart in something if you don't want to do it. Hmm. But so I think the first thing to kind of like what I'm saying so far is that in order to think about in order to think about this clearly, you have to understand that thoughts themselves aren't necessarily your possessions and they're not your identity. And if you see it that way, it can be very hard to talk about these things objectively because it it's sort of to put a judgment on thoughts is the same thing as putting a judgment on yourself. And so it's not to say that thoughts are unnecessary. It's not to say that it's unnecessary to have like an ego and opinions and views about the world. Because I mean, some people will say that an ego is unnecessary, but that's completely a different topic. And yeah, maybe I'll talk about that sometime. But the idea of thoughts being unnecessary is is a step back from that and is essentially putting forth the question of whether the result of thoughts or the actual action of thinking is beneficial to somebody. And obviously, it's beneficial in a more mundane context where you need to make a decision about, like, I don't know what, you're driving down the street and you think there's going to be traffic one way and not traffic the other way. So you think about it and decide to go the faster way. That's pretty reasonable and harder to do without thinking. Not impossible, obviously, but thinking is the more traditionally straightforward way to do something like that. But with meditation and even meditative contemplation, which is kind of like a finer, like a component of a meditation practice, thinking is actually a less efficient way to do it than accomplishing the same results without thinking. And I think this is something that is a lot easier to understand if you've experienced it directly. And I think everyone has experienced some amount of this, but I don't think I can really, I don't think I understand it quite well enough to explain the way in which this is kind of a part of just mundane everyday consciousness. But as a part of a deep meditation practice, you can kind of have this contemplation without thinking in a yeah, this is something that occurs without it's almost like it feels like thinking, but there's no words being produced. You can almost think of it as like if you hmm, yeah, it's like if you have a stamp, like an old-fashioned stamp where you like the way they would make it would be to have some material that you can carve. So you carve the material into a stamp and then dip it in ink and then put it on a page to put like the pattern on the page. And the contemplation without actual thought happening is it's kind of like carving a stamp, but then never actually uh, putting it in ink and then putting it on a page. We can think of the putting it in ink as kind of preparing your mind to generate a linguistic thought, like a thought that takes the form of words, and then putting it on the page is the actual thinking of the thought, like the verbal speaking, which I could have clarified maybe is what I'm saying when I say thought is the very specific verbal thinking that goes on in your head, like the internal monologue. And so you can do this process of, as I was saying, carving the stamp and essentially forming your mind into the shape that would lead to thinking. You can do that without the thinking actually happening afterwards. And this, if you understand what I'm saying, you maybe see that this process can happen much more quickly than the process of thinking. Because if you consider that, like, I don't claim that this is actually that like what I described is really the neurophysical process, because I don't think anybody really knows that. But if that is how it works, where you set things in place, then you prepare them and then apply the thought. That process happens as a cycle because you can't prepare the thought in the same action that you're applying it and like putting the stamp on the page. And so there's always going to be a cycling and a delay between generating the thought and having the thought. But if you can essentially generate thoughts without having them, without them turning into words, you can continuously be generating thoughts. And there's actually nothing that slows it down. And so rather than thinking at a speed that's similar to the speed that you would think, that similar to a talking speed, where you kind of consider things and then say them verbally, you essentially can think at any speed. And it's something that would almost just be limited by your ability to, I don't even know what, like, hone your mind into a high-speed thinking device or something. I don't really know how to describe that, but essentially, this removes a certain limitation that, that the verbal thinking puts on the overall, process of, yeah, I guess whatever the process outside of thinking, I guess, like, the contemplation or something. It removes a limiting factor in that process. And, so yeah, that's a reason why. Mm, yeah, that gives you an idea, at least, of why it would be good to not have the, to essentially have your thinking occur. Yeah, it's like this is like the end goal in a way of finding a way to use your mind without the verbal thinking occurring in the same way, which is, I think, a lot of times what people are talking about when they say that you want to reduce the number of thoughts you have, or try to quiet your mind and make your mind, um, yeah, free of thoughts and that type of thing. But this is all about the end goal and the reasons why the end goal is, a better way for your mind to work. But it doesn't really speak to the reasons for doing this, like the reasons for initiating the process, or the ways in which it's beneficial along the way, or of course the strategies for actually achieving this. Because just thinking about the end goal and trying to get that end goal of a mind that doesn't have to think is, just striving directly for that doesn't actually lead there necessarily, because it can be further off than you think, and the direction that you start in might go in a different direction, and you might just end up, what I think something people do is they end up, kind of quieting their mind too much and preventing their mind from doing any type of contemplation, any type of thinking. So they essentially get rid of the verbal thinking, but also get rid of the process that generates the verbal thinking, and it's actually the process that you want to keep. So, mm, so yeah, I think. Apologize. This is a little bit of an unconscious, unfocused video. Vegas is this is kind of just like a rambling about the general concept of thinking. Because I'm not quite experienced enough to have a really clear message about this. But yeah, I'll move on to talking a bit about reasons why thinking is actually good, and I'll kind of put aside the process I was talking about of, finding a way to, contemplate without the verbal thoughts going on. Because what I'm about to talk about of, is kind of a type of contemplation, which, uh, you could probably do in the way that I was describing without the verbal thought. But for most people, the way they contemplate things and consider things is through that verbal, like, internal talking process. So, so yeah, the reasons, mm, yeah, the overall reason why it's useful to, develop your ability to think is because hmm, well, I guess obviously it's dependent on the goal that you have. So you might not have the goal of, like the Buddhist liberation, or, um, whatever other, like religious, spiritual motivations. But even in just the very, I don't know what, American traditional way of just wanting to be smarter and more effective at whatever you're doing, being able to think more effectively and more quickly is, in many cases, not in all cases necessarily, but for the most part, it is something that you want to develop and you want to, be able to get better at. And I think it's easy to see why it's a good thing for, yeah, like mundane society. But even for like I see if you put it on like a spectrum, mundane society is it's very obvious why thinking is good, and people don't even consider the fact that thinking isn't always the best thing to do. Um, Completely on the other side is the really purist Buddhist non-duality type of things, where people tend to think that thinking is a bad thing and that it gets in the way. And I think it really is, even if your goal is the very purified, refined mind of a Buddhist, like a Buddhist meditator, the process of thinking is still the most efficient way to get there. And you might think less for that than you would for other things, but being able to think and essentially using your thoughts as a tool is still quite fundamental to the process, at least from the way I see it. Because in order to make progress along the path of, um, whatever you call it, like mental purification, I want to keep it a little more general because the idea of enlightenment is kind of specifically Buddhist, and I mean from some yeah, from from some perspectives doesn't even require any work. You just kind of get there instantly when you know what to do. But the process of mental purification is something that requires work and requires progress, kind of like incremental progress to be made. And so in that process of purifying and refining your mind, the the ability to make your mind and body very still is is one of the fundamental ways that you can do this, because it allows you to get into the meditative states and allows you to um, free the energy that gets stuck in different parts of your body, and to essentially quiet things down enough that you can find the hard to find things within your body and within your mind. And so those parts of it are benefited from not thinking very much. But the way you actually get to that stillness is, well, it's not so simple as there being one way to get there, but being able to think about things and contemplate the ways in which different spiritual concepts and different spiritual teachings and different um, think about like laws of nature and things like that, the way they apply to your experience and the way that you can essentially fit your mind, like sort of shape your mind in alignment with the spiritual teachings, is a process that involves a lot of thinking, at least in my experience. So, for example, you would say, yeah, like one of the very common one is that killing is wrong, and that's like a pretty ubiquitous spiritual teaching. Is that like killing sentient beings is a wrong thing to do, and what you mean by wrong is obviously up to interpretation. Even I mean, obviously every part of it is up to interpretation, but being able to think about things and consider, if I step on a blade of grass, am I killing the grass? That type of thing. Being able to have those types of discursive thoughts in your head, where you kind of question things and then make an answer to that question. You say, no, like I killed a single blade of grass, but the plant itself lives on because there's so many other blades. And you can see that through that thinking process, you sort of incorporated a teaching into your mind and can now reference it again when you find your mind in a state of doubt or a state of confusion about your experience. And yeah, during a meditation, like through the practice of meditation, it's useful to do this. Uh, hmm, Yeah, it's essential to or it's essential. It's useful to do that type of process, continuously and through a lot of different things that you experience where you hmm, I wanna be careful and say that I'm not saying this is, like, the right way to do it. This is just kinda, like, the way that I understand to do it is to essentially, learn a bunch of things, like, gather a bunch of spiritual teachings and use the thinking process to incorporate them into your kind of just incorporate them into your mind, and then when you sit in meditation, your mind can get kind of quiet, but there's a level to which it can't, uh, get any more quiet, any more still, and there's a lot of reasons that can happen, but one of the common reasons is that you kind of you don't understand where to go next, or you feel confused about what you're experiencing because you kind of cleared away the things that you do understand. They've kind of, uh, emptied from your mind, and your mind is a state where it's more empty, but the next thing it has to face is something that you don't quite understand. And so using those teachings that you've incorporated into the mind, you can essentially use the previous thinking that you've done as, a way to call you back to those teachings to then potentially do more thinking about it because um, you like hold on to that same teaching, but then you find yourself in a new mental state where you don't quite understand what to think of things. But from that new state, you've been able to yeah, it's like you can sort of repeat the process of hearing a spiritual teaching and refining your mind in its current state, using that teaching and using the thinking as a way of questioning the state, like questioning the way your mind feels and getting an answer about it. And you essentially form a cycle within your mind where you have confusion, you access a teaching, and then you have an answer that kind of calms your mind and allows you to move on to the next thing. And yeah, this is I feel like I'm going down a rabbit hole a little bit about the idea of like how to learn spiritual things. But obviously this is just one way of doing it, and I feel obligated also to say that it's not you shouldn't do this with every spiritual teaching. Like another benefit of thinking, I think, is to really consider whether a certain teaching is something that you want, something that you want as a part of your as a part of your mind, as a part of your meditation, because not every teaching is going to be useful to you or just useful in general. There's a lot of silly teachings out there. I don't know, but yeah, the ability to think about things and to have uh, essentially a well-developed thinking mind is is really beneficial for this type of thing and beneficial for essentially just being able to learn spiritual things and have that learning actually carry over into the state of mind that you enter when you meditate. Because the meditative state of mind is even one where there is thoughts going on. Like it's not like the really deep state of like perfect stillness, that type of thing. Like perfect stillness or whatever. But it's not quite as still as like a thoughtless mind. But there's thinking going on. In order to have that be like a useful state to be in, rather than being a distracted state, which might be how people present it when they say that you shouldn't think. Essentially, having your thinking mind still be a part of your meditation. It's important to understand how it works, or gain some understanding of how it works, and to see the ways in which it can bring in useful ideas and useful teachings, and and yeah, to essentially use it as a tool rather than just seeing it as a roadblock in the process. Hmm. Yeah, I think that's pretty much it. I think that's probably some useful ideas about some useful thoughts about thinking or whatever. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed, and I hope this generates good thoughts in your mind. And also, yeah, I guess this is my first video with my new phone. I imagine the video quality is probably a lot better. My previous phone was, like, 5 generations back from this one, so with how things progress, I think this probably is probably a lot better. But but yeah, thanks for watching. Like, comment, subscribe, and meditate.